Okay, if everyone starts sitting down, please. Okay, everybody sit down. Talk about start. You're ready to start.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. Dear brothers, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, tonight is the last night of the year of 2024, at least according to the Gregorian calendar. And as we see, mashallah, many people are busy elsewhere. Perhaps they're watching things on television, perhaps they're visiting other events, and perhaps this is just another day. Indeed, if you look to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, in Sham, you can see that this for them is just another day. It isn't a day of a remarkable day. It isn't a day to remember. Perhaps in future, this would be a day to forget, because Allah Azza wa Jal has made them, chosen them for these great ibtila'at. But whilst He may remember every single one who suffered, whether it's on the battlefields and the bombed out homes and schools and masajid and hospitals in Gaza, or whether it's the dungeons and the torture sites of Farah, Palestine, or of Sadnaya, or of Qasiyun, or of the host of other secret detention sites that have only just come to light now in Syria, most of the world seems to have forgotten. And this evening, even though there's a few of us, inshallah, it's an attempt to ensure that they remain in our dua, that they remain in our thoughts, that they remain at least in the most basic of our actions, whether we take part actively in boycotting Israeli goods or goods that are supplied by organizations and companies and manufacturers that support Israel in its genocide, or while it's conducting its genocide, or whether it's looking to Bilad al-Sham or looking towards Syria in particular with hope, rather than looking at it as some kind of Zionist conspiracy. Because once again, Muslims get caught between a rock and a hard place. If you see what's happening in Palestine, you realize and recognize that this was once a sort of tasfiyah. It was a sort of cleansing, of separation, of recognizing where people really stood, not just in their Islam, but also even in their humanity. Did they see the humanity of our brothers and sisters in Palestine? Did they see the humanity of the child who has lost both his legs and crawling around? Did they see the humanity of the mother who packs the entirety of her family into 2 black bags because that's all that's left of them? Did they see the humanity of the thousands of women and children in refugee camps with a lack of sanitation, with the lack of even the basic freedoms of movement? And if that was one part of the tasfiyah which recognized those who see our brothers and sisters as subhuman, then the next step was that those who did support our brothers and sisters in Palestine, for whatever reason, we saw that they didn't support the brothers and sisters who faced the greatest tyrant in modern history in the Arab world, Bashar al-Assad, as a representative of his father and the Ba'athist creed and belief system. We saw very clearly that on the one hand, some may support Palestine, but they did not support the revolution in Syria. And they presented it and presented continually to this day, even over the past 3 weeks, as some type of Western Zionist-backed conspiracy to support Israel. So that's where we're stuck as a community. And we'll see many Muslims in some places, not perhaps too many, but some, confused on Syria. Clear on Palestine, but confused on Syria. And that's why it's so imperative for us to recognize, as often has been said, history never started on October the 7th. That's true. But history didn't just start in Palestine either. History started as far as we can go back when we look at the acts of oppression and how Islam came as a salvation for mankind. When the Prophet ﷺ said in the most famous hadith that some of you may have heard me say often, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ فَلَا خَيْرَ فِيكُمْ, that if the people of this region become corrupted, there's no good in you. And remember at that time he was talking to the Sahaba, خَيْرُ الْقُرُبِ, the best of generations. He's saying to them, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ, أهل الشام, the people of Syria, the people of Palestine, the people of Lebanon, the people of Jordan, and even a little bit of Turkey. If the people of this entire region become corrupted, there's no good left in you, Ya Abu Bakr, Ya Umar, Ya Uthman, Ya Ali. There's no good in you. And this land was so blessed and continues to be blessed that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ, He's talking about this land, the land of At-Teen, the land of Zaytun, the land of Isa alayhi salam. This is the region that he's speaking of. And you know, it's famous for its olives and for its fig trees. But before that even, it's famous for its anbiya, that it was the land of the anbiya and rusul. You take a city, for example, in Hebrew they call it Hebron, but to the Muslims it's known as Al-Khalil. It's the land, the place believed to be the burial place of what they call the patriarchs, Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ishaq. And it's a place that perhaps wherever you walk, especially in the region, in Al-Aqsa wa ma hawlaha, and what's around it, you're stepping into the footsteps of the Rusul and the Anbiya and the Sahaba. Amongst the great leaders of the Muslims and the great Sahaba buried in these lands is Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. Under him, this region was taken under the leadership of Khalid ibn Walid, but he was appointed by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, by Umar ibn Khattab, afwan, as the leader in this region. And remember the Prophet ﷺ said about him, in the early days when father and son were in some cases put against one another, when brother was against brother. Do you remember? Now, you know, think about this. Tonight, perhaps many other nights, we have our du'at doing a wondrous job around the world, calling people to Islam and say, MashaAllah, look, another brother, he became Muslim, another sister, she became a Muslim, and MashaAllah, tabarakallah, look at our beautiful numbers everywhere. Our du'at on the streets of Birmingham and in the streets of London and Leicester and Manchester, and you name the city, we've got du'at. And every week people entering Islam. Fi deen Allahi afwaja. And everywhere you look, masajid. Everywhere you look, huffaz. The whole world is filled with the growth of Islam. In every nook and cranny, wherever you go to a little village in Poland, you'll find Muslims. You go to somewhere in Caracas, in Venezuela, you'll find Muslims. You go to Brazil, you go to South Korea, you'll find the rise of Islam. Islam is spreading everywhere, وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْمُشْرِكُونَ, even though the pagans detest it. But there is one really important question to ask, a really, really fundamental question. If our numbers are so important and count for something, why are we so humiliated now as an ummah more than ever in our modern history? What is it that our numbers, they speak for? Even if you look in the United Kingdom, for example, the most common name in the United Kingdom is Muhammad. It surpassed John. What's the reason then that we are so humiliated? And the answer, of course, is this was all foretold. The Prophet ﷺ said, يُوشِكَ الْأُمَمَ أَن تَدَعَ عَلَيْكُمْ كَمَا تَدَعَ الْأَكَلَةُ إِلَى قَصْعَتِهَا, that the nations will gather together, invite one another to eat and feast from your lands like animals do at a gathering. And the Sahaba said, أَمِنْ قِلَّةٍ نَحْمَ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Will we be few in number on that day? Because to the Sahaba it was simple. It was simple that the only way that our land, that our unity could have been dispersed and dissected is because of a lack of number. And to the Sahaba, numbers was about a quality of numbers. In 10 years of da'wah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in 13 years of da'wah in Mecca, no more than 200 Sahaba. But the quality of these Sahaba was so stringent. People who recited the Quran at night and fought and defended Islam in the day and did every one of the fara'id of Islam that was revealed upon them, they became the bearers of the burden of Islam. And they were the ones who spread the deen and later became the governors of Islam. They weren't just people who knew how to recite the Quran or just know how to memorize it and to teach it and to verbalize it and to recite it and make it sound beautiful as we have today. That if someone only, you'll know him by how beautifully the recitation is and your heart will be attached to that, but not to his actions. You won't know him for his stance. You won't know him for taking a position and suffering for taking that position. You'll know him because he made you feel good from the recitation of the Quran. But Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah radiallahu anhu was not from such people. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَمِينٌ وَأَمِينُ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah. That every ummah, every nation has its ameen, its guardian, its trustworthy person. And of the Sahaba, of the Ashar al-Mubashireen bil Jannah, he's the one who's granted this wondrous title, this epithet, that this man is the guardian of the ummah. And what does a guardian do? Does a guardian just sit and talk? Or does a guardian guard? What does the Prophet ﷺ say about guards? عَيْنَانِ لَا تَمَسُّهُمُ النَّارِ عَيْنٌ بَكَتْ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ. Two eyes that will never see the hellfire. An eye that cries from the fear of Allah. وَعَيْنٌ بَاتَتْ تَحْرِسُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And an eye that stays awake, remaining, guarding for the sake of Allah. Doesn't go to sleep. That's who Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah was, and he is buried in this land. And amongst them are people like Bilal ibn Rabah, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا Bilal. Bilal, we all know. Imagine, he is risen up in the streets of Mecca and tortured and abused and rocks placed upon him and whipped and discriminated against as not just a slave but also as a black man. He rises when the time is right. Of course, in the Battle of Badr, he takes out Umayyah bin Khalaf, one of the leaders. Allah has honored this otherwise man who's being debased. He's honored him to carry out and to destroy one of the leaders of the Quraysh at the Battle of Badr, the most decisive battle in the history of Islam. And Bilal's rank is raised so much, and then eventually he makes hijrah and goes to Bilad al-Sham. And in Bilad al-Sham he remains, and he wants to fight to defend Islam. And he remains there until he passes away. And there's many stories of Bilal radiallahu anhu there. But perhaps, subhanallah, you think of one of the most celebrated generals in the history of mankind, perhaps not celebrated so much in the Western world, but certainly in the Muslim world, and even those who are true to the sources of history and to the facts, recognize Sayf Allah al-Maslul, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, buried in the city of Homs, that he himself becomes, perhaps after the Prophet ﷺ, one of the most recognized names in the history of Islam. And yet, he as a general, as a leader, as a role model for our youth to this day, isn't remembered as somebody who was killed in the battlefield. He's remembered as somebody who was never defeated in the battlefield, not even when he was a disbeliever. And Allah Azza wa Jal raised his rank so high that the Prophet ﷺ granted him this title, Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the unsheathed sword of Allah, the sword of Allah. And one of the reasons when he says infamously or famously at his deathbed, here I am, dying. There's not one part of my body that has not seen a stroke from a sword, or a strike of a spear, or an arrow from a bow hurled at me. And here I am dying like an old rag. And famously, he says, فَلَا نَامَتْ أَعْيُنُ الْجُبَنَاءِ, let the eyes of the cowards never be pleased. Meaning, what does that mean? Let not anybody quote and say that, look at Khalid, in the end, you know what, he just chose his bed and he just died like anyone else. And someone told him, Ya Khalid, you were given the name Sayf Allah al-Maslul. You were known as the drawn sword of Allah. You could never break in battle. You couldn't die in battle. It was not destined for you. And there he lies in Homs, remembered throughout history and as a role model for the whole Muslim world. This region is filled. The Prophet ﷺ used to say, Allahumma barik lana fi shamina, Allahumma barik lana fi yamanina. That Allah grant us blessing from these two places, from Sham and from Yemen. So there are too many connections to this, why this place is indeed the beating heart and soul of the Ummah. Yes, of course, it was Bilad al-Haramain. It was the two holy mosques, these lands. They will always be the place of the Prophet ﷺ where his message came and then where he made hijrah to. But remember, the Sahaba, we could not love the Prophet ﷺ more than the Sahaba loved him. It's impossible. Yet the Sahaba, they made hijrah for something greater than their love for the Prophet ﷺ. And that was for this message to spread throughout the world. They went north, south, east, and west. It didn't stop them. They continued in their message, and that's why you'll find Sahaba from all over, buried all around the world. Haram is buried in Cyprus. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas is buried in China. Abu Ayyub al-Ansari is buried in Turkey. You'll find Sahaba buried everywhere, everywhere. And they were from amongst the very first. In that first 13 years, they became nurtured, taught, able, conditioned, prepared, so that one day when the message falls upon their shoulders, that they will be able to carry it out with integrity, with justice, with honor, with truth, and with hope. And it's because of their sacrifices that we are Muslims today, all of us. It's sometimes hard to kind of separate between at least historically, between what we know today as Palestine and between Sham. These are all relatively modern constructions. So if you look at Syria today, the map of Syria, out of all of these four places, it's the largest entity, largest physical area compared to, say, Lebanon, or compared to Jordan, or compared even to Palestine as we know it. And one of the things about Palestine is the Prophet ﷺ was asked in relation to when he said, وَلَا يَزَالْ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْ أُمَّتِي مَنْصُورِينَ, that there will always be a group of my ummah victorious. لَا يَضُرُّهُم مَّنْ خَذَلَهُم, that they will not be harmed by those who are treacherous towards them, حَتَّى تَقُومُ السَّاعَةُ, until the final hour. And in another hadith that's similar, he's asked, أَيْنَ هُمْ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ, who are these people? And he responds by saying, بَيْتَ الْمَقْدِسِ وَأَكْنَافِ بَيْتِ الْمَقْدِسِ. So it is Al-Quds, Al-Sharif, Al-Quds, and the Bayt al-Maqdis in it, and everything that's around it. And what's around it today, how it's seen today, it's very compartmentalized. Every region has its own it's its own marking, its own country, and so forth. But at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it wasn't seen as such. Aknaf al-Bayt al-Maqdis included Syria. It included Jordan and the lands that exist today. And it's important that we know throughout history, these regions primarily were under the Khulafa al-Rashidin, and then under the Umayyads, and then after that under the Abbasiyin, and then after that under the Uthmani Khilafah, the Ottomans. And then after that, we come to the period at which we now begin modern history. And modern history, by its very nature, why after the division of the Uthmani Khilafah, necessitated that they drew lines. And those lines sometimes were based upon interests of the competing colonial powers, i.e. Britain, France, Belgium, and beyond. But also geographical partitions that existed naturally. That was the past. So when they came along, you can look at the maps of various countries, you can see straight lines. Literally, they took rulers and divided the Muslim lands in straight lines, in most, where there weren't natural partitions, they literally divided up, carved up the Muslim world. And what we see today is a result of that carving up, to the point at which, and it has permeated our societies so deeply, that to this day, even if I was to say in this room right now, with all the different backgrounds we have, whether it's Pakistani, whether it's Egyptian or Libyan or Bangladeshi or Moroccan or wherever you're from, if something encroaches upon your sense of nationality, especially when it's placed in competition with someone else, even though it's your Muslim brother, you will feel a sense of being wronged. And this has played upon our ummah so terribly that it has caused us to continue to fight one another in ways that could never have happened in the past. Of course there were fights. I mean, if you look back at history, you'll find that even the Muslims were fighting each other. There's no doubt about that. But not on the scale of this division. Wherever you look, now for example, if you look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, they're striking one another. They're attacking one another. If you look at the borders with Syria, conflict, occupation, for example, by the Americans and in the names of protecting the Kurds. The Turks in the name of protecting themselves from the Kurds. The Israelis in the names of protecting themselves in their fake nation that has occupied and taken all Muslim land in that region. And the Russians, present there in the name of defending the previous regime. Everybody has a hand. Kullu hizbin bima ladayhim farihun. Every group is pleased with what it possesses. And something I've often said, if you look recently, I don't want to give the example of Europe because Brexit in the end kind of became a disaster for Britain. If you look at the history of Europe, you know when they say Islam is a religion of violence, it should be put in the context of who's saying this and where it's coming from. The most violent nation in the history of mankind is the United States of America. It has carried out the most violent acts with the most destructive weapons known to mankind. You see Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the past, but even recently, the killing of 1 million people in Iraq, the killing of over 250,000 in Afghanistan, the killing of tens of thousands right across the Muslim world, from Syria to Libya and beyond. In fact, the numbers of people that they kill are so many, nobody bothers to count. It's just maybe a few million. You might get it wrong by 2 or 3 million. Who cares? If a few million Muslims are dead, who really cares? And that's not just in the Muslim world, right across. If you look at Vietnam and Korea and Grenada and Panama and the world wars, World War I and World War II, the War of Independence. If you look at the Civil War, 1 million people died in America just killing each other. So let's not get fooled when we look at people telling us that Muslims are by definition violent people. We have violence amongst us, of course we do. But we are not by definition violent, certainly not as violent as the West. And what greater act of violence could there be than the killing of 60 million people, which is what happened in World War II. And World War II was not a Muslim issue. It was the West killing each other, bombarding each other, occupying one another's land, creating ideologies, fascism, Nazism, anti-Semitism, communism. All of these ideologies came from the West. They had nothing to do with Islam at all. And so one of the things that results from this butchery is they create a thing called the League of Nations, which becomes the precursor to the United Nations. And in it, they create a set of laws and ideals, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles, which says, for example, every person, every human being has the right to justice. Every human being has the freedom of movement. Every human being has the freedom not to be tortured. Every human being has the freedom to live a meaningful life, safe from oppression. They put all these articles down because prior to this, they didn't have them. These articles did not exist. It came out of the killing of one another, 60 million people. And so they produced these sets of laws, and amongst them the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and beyond, to hold powers and people to account. And then out of that came something, for Europe in particular, called the European Union. Despite the decade, in fact, there's centuries of war with one another, fighting with one another. The French against the English against the Welsh against the Scots, and the Scots against the English, and all of them against the Irish. Decades and centuries of war. And the different languages to this day, if you go to Wales, they still have their own language. Irish have their own Gaelic, let alone in France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Switzerland and Sweden and Holland and beyond. Each group has its own very distinct, unique identity, despite them all being Christians of one sort or another. They were able to come together in monetary union. They were able to come together in the union of movement and freedom of movement. They were able to come together on so many aspects of human coexistence. If you were to look into the Muslim world, from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, you have one basic general faith. If you were to look at least in the Arab world, you have one language that goes from Morocco all the way to Iraq. You had a history of similar cultures, of faith, of people united, the Arabic language preserved because of the Quran. Unlike Latin, for example, Latin was taught in schools up until the 1980s. I studied Latin myself, but it was a dead language. Nobody speaks Latin to this day. It's finished. It used to be the language of the clergy, of the churches. But nobody could understand Latin. Nobody could understand Latin except the church's leaders, the priests and so forth. So it was destined to be ended. If that was to happen with the Arabic language today, that nobody speaks Arabic except the ulama, the Arabic language too would be dead, but it won't be because it is preserved by the Quran. Allah Azza wa Jalla, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr wa inna lahu lahafidhun." We've sent down this revelation and we will maintain its preservation. And it remains to this day. Ordinary young child can learn Arabic just as much as a scholar. It's not a protected or preserved language just for the elite. So despite all of these disunities that the West has had, the Muslims have far more to keep them united, far more that unites their history. Everybody agrees on the basic history of Islam. You have the convulsion with the Shia, of course, but everybody agrees on the basic history of Islam. And what unites us is far stronger than what disunites us. And what disunites us is this toxic, evil nationalism that's designed to destroy our ranks. And anybody that comes across, if you want to have a testing yard, a yardstick to see where a person's belief really lies, test them on the concept of nationalism. That's when you'll understand what they want. A really interesting thing I saw recently in Syria. I remember I was there in 2013. And many people had come from all over the world, many people, to come to defend the Syrian people from the brutality, the evil brutality of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And amongst the people I was surprised to see were people from East Turkestan, the Uyghurs as they're known. I'd met some of these brothers back many years in Afghanistan, and I'd seen there was 22 of them with us in Guantanamo. And one of the things that the brothers, some of them have been here, one of the things that these brothers said to us, which was surprising, because Guantanamo was a place of torture, of abuse, of religious, racial, and sexual abuse. It was a horrible place. But we have to be just even to our enemies. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina lillahi shuhada'a bil qist." O you who believe, stand as just witnesses for Allah. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنَ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَىٰ. And do not allow your animosity of a people to cause you to swerve from injustice. Be just, that's closer to taqwa. The Uyghur brothers would say to us, "Akhi, alhamdulillah, that we were sent to Guantanamo and not to China." And the reason why they say that is because at least when we were in Guantanamo, we prayed, we fasted, we were able to hold on to our deen. Yes, they abused the Quran. Yes, they hurt us. Yes, they violated us. But you know, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and some of you may have met some of these brothers, they were brothers and sisters in Guantanamo. I say brothers and sisters because they were US soldiers who became Muslims. Now imagine going to a place in East Turkestan where you are forced to renounce your shahada, where you are forced to drink alcohol, where you are forced to eat pork, where your wife, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all our brothers, where your wife is forced to cohabit with a Han Chinese person while you're taken as the man to a re-education camp where you are taught the Communist Party manifesto in place of the Shahada, and where your child is sent to an orphanage even though they are alive and indoctrinated with so-called Chinese values. That's what's happening in East Turkestan, a systematic attempt to wipe out the culture, the religion, the faith, the language of the people of East Turkestan. So you wonder, why are so many of them in Syria? Why are so many of these Turkic-speaking people, they're not even from Turkey, which is next door, they're from East Turkestan. There's about 6 or 7 countries, all ending with Stan, in between there and then. And the answer is, these of course are the original Turks. But more importantly, they found a refuge where they could be protected. They helped in the revolution. They sacrificed. Syrian blood alongside Turkestani blood mingles together to form the lifeblood or the future for Syria as it is today. And one of the things the leader Jolani said, was that anybody who sacrificed for this glorious liberation, wherever they're from, they are part of us. They are from amongst us. They believe in our cause. They sacrifice for our cause, and they have just as much right as anybody else. And think about that. And he quoted and said, you know, people in other countries, after living 4, 5, 6, 10 or odd years, they live in the country and they have the right to citizenship. That's true in some places, but sadly, not in the Arab and Muslim world. In the Arab and Muslim world, you can live there all of your life, as happens in many cases, but you will never be seen as equal. You will never be seen as the Sahaba were seen by the Prophet ﷺ. Suhaib al-Rumi, Bilal al-Habashi, Salman al-Farsi. They were given statuses despite where they came from. So it's a good sign to see this attitude, because generally when people think of a place armed, foreigners, La ilaha illallah, and you put it all together, you think that's trouble. And as I have seen through my work over past 2 decades, people will get sold out, they'll get sent to different countries, they'll be resettled or resent home, extradited, and then straight into prison where they're tortured, their families are abused, and as a result, just as a name that you are a foreign fighter, that will haunt you for the rest of your life. And that's because largely due to the concept of nationalism, not because this person went to help and should be rewarded for the sacrifice that they gave up. Rather, why did this person go and not remain in his state? So I want to talk to you very briefly about one particular individual whose case I have been campaigning for and trying to fight for. There are a few cases, inshallah, I'll mention, and inshallah come to an end. The first is a Palestinian brother. His name is Zain al-Abidin Muhammad Hussein Abu Zubaydah. I'm sure some of you may have heard me mention him before, if you've ever heard me talk. And he is a Palestinian, originally from Gaza. He grew up in Ramallah and so forth, and he used to throw stones at the tanks that used to come into his household. And he, in the 1970s, was searching for an identity. And he followed eventually after, like many of the Palestinians in the diaspora, have gone on looking for a place where they fit. He went to South Asia, and then from there heard about the jihad in Afghanistan. And he heard about somebody called Abdullah Azzam, a great scholar from Palestine, a great scholar who used to teach and learn in Egypt and then in Palestine and traveled the Middle East, and then eventually went to Pakistan to teach, and eventually into Afghanistan, where he became famous as a person who invited what's known as the Afghan Arabs into Afghanistan to fight to defend the Afghans, not from capitalist America this time, but from communist Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And their contribution has borne testament to their sacrifice, and Abu Zubaydah caught the tail end of that. But the thing that really connected him was, why is this Palestinian scholar, why has he left Palestine to come to Afghanistan? What's his reasoning? Why does he want to do that? Why does he stay in Palestine? Why doesn't this Palestinian stay in Palestine? And of course, if you think about it that way, it makes sense, if you're thinking in nationalistic terms. But if you're thinking in what's known as ummatic terms, as in we are the ummah, if one part of the body feels pain, the rest of the part of the body feels the pain. So Sheikh Abdul Azzam went there first to explore, to find out what's happening there. He saw the level. Remember, this is a superpower occupying and attempting to annihilate one of the poorest nations in the world, Afghanistan. And in doing so, they used the latest weapons, including chemical weapons, including the largest weighing ordnance bombs that you can imagine. and unleashing those weapons, causing the deaths of close to over 1 million people. Abdullah Azzam goes there and he starts to invite people to not only practice their faith under the shade of bombs and swords, but he does so reminding them that one day he hopes to create an army that is so full of faith and so full of experience and so full of taqwa that one day perhaps they may be able to go back and liberate Al-Quds. That was his intention. So Abu Zubaydah joins at the tail end of that and eventually starts getting involved in a process that takes him to the world's most notorious prison. Abu Zubaydah gets captured, not because he's trying to attack America, he's not. He doesn't care about America. He cares about his homeland. He wants to go back to Palestine. He wants it to be liberated. But instead, he's captured based on false and fake information, presented as a member of Al-Qaeda who he's not, and then he's tortured through a series of torture sites right across the world, from Thailand to Poland to Lithuania to Romania and beyond. And his torture is so horrific. It is so horrific that it takes him many years to even verbalize what happened to him. But if you want to know more about Abu Zubaydah's case, just simply do a Google search and you can find in the New York Times self-portraits of his torture, of how, where, why he was tortured. Abu Zubaydah remains in Guantanamo without charge or trial. He is known, or his nickname is the Forever Prisoner, meaning that they cannot and will not charge him with a crime, but they will not release him. Not because of what he did, because he never harmed a single American, but because what was done to him by Americans. Another case I wanted to mention to you was a young man, and just to give you an idea, the kinds of people who, what kind of blood was shed in Bilad al-Sham. And this is something that I know to some extent on a personal level. I remember once, it was in 2012 or 13, in Syria. I was asleep in a room with about 5 or 6 brothers from different parts of the world, Syrians and Arabs and beyond. And it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, my eyes just opened. And this was way before Fajr. As I opened my eyes, everybody was asleep except for one young man. And he was in sajda. He was in sajda all the way, as long as I can remember. I went back to sleep, he's still in sajda. And I noted that in my head. The next day I saw exactly the same thing again. And what was funny about this brother is that you would never expect it, that he's that kind of person. He's a joker. You all have jokers amongst us, right? People who's always cracking jokes and laughing, making you laugh, teasing, making fun. He's the kind of guy who does that. But I saw him, the few nights I was there, I saw him in sajda every night before Fajr. And then I noted that at food time, a time to eat, especially at Maghrib time, he would eat. But at other times, especially during the day, he wouldn't. So I asked brothers who knew him better than I did, I said, does this brother, is he in the Tahajjud every night? He said, yeah, it's normal. And is he doing the fast of Dawood alayhi salam? Is he fasting one day, missing one day, meaning he fasts 6 months of the year? They said, yeah, he does. That's him normally. I could never have imagined it. He's a young man from Egypt. And then a couple of days later, I was with him one night. The next day, I heard that they brought this brother, that he's been killed. And they brought his body back to where we were staying, to the maqbara, to the graveyard. And I remember I had the honor of carrying his body and helping to lower him into the grave and pushing him in and putting the blocks on and covering him. There was no Salat al-Janazah. There was no ghusl. There was no changing of his clothes. I had some of his blood on my hands. And it was the most simple burial that you can see. And that's how tens of thousands were buried in this way. Then I asked how he died. And this is to tell you the kind of nature. Look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen him. He was a fighter. And what had happened is that where he was, there was an alleyway where there was a sniper from the Assad regime fighters. And he was with one group, but a person from another group had been hit in the shoulder or in the chest somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where, but he was wounded. And the sniper was waiting to shoot whoever comes to rescue him. So nobody would go forward. Everybody's worried that if I get in the line of fire down this alleyway, I'm a sitting duck. So this brother, his name is Abu Qudama. Abu Qudama, the Egyptian brother we were talking about, he steps forward. And before he leaves the area where he's not seen, he goes into sajda. He has his rifle with him, he has a few magazines with him, and he's in sajda. And he remained in sajda for a long, long time. And then he crawls out and he fires to give himself cover, and he grabs the wounded person, the wounded brother, and starts pulling him back. As he's pulling him and pulling him and pulling him, he tries to shoot, and then his gun jams, and he needs to change his magazine. And as he tries to do that, right in his head, he's killed. And that's how this brother died. Now, the reason I told you this story isn't just to give you a story, is to tell you that, imagine, that's just one person out of thousands. Remember I said earlier on that the Sahaba said, أَمِن قِلَّةٍ نَحْنُ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Are we going to be few in number on that day when our ummah is ripped apart? And the Prophet ﷺ said, لَكِنَّكُمْ سَتَكُونُ كَالْغُثَاءِ السَّيْلِ. You're going to be like the filth, useless scum, waste, what's the word, waste men of the flood water. And Allah Azza wa Jal will remove from the hearts of your enemy the fear. وَلَيَقْذِفَنَّ اللَّهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمُ الْوَهْنَ. And He'll place in your hearts, He'll throw into your hearts al-wahan. And they said, وَمَا الْوَهَنْ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. What is this wahan, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةَ الْمَوْتِ. Loving this life and detesting, fearing, hating, despising meeting Allah, meeting death. That's why you will be in such a humiliated position. And that's why, if you recall, I said, how come we have such massive numbers, so many people entering Islam, so many marakiz and masajid and du'at and ulama, mashallah, everywhere you look, huffaz, everywhere you look, huffaz. Why is it that we are so humiliated? Answer to me is simple. It's absolutely simple. And that's why, if you really want to look at the beating heart of this ummah, and you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen people in Bilad al-Sham, in the whole meaning of the term Bilad al-Sham, for us to look at examples, one after the other, we can find that there are people who are true to the term of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ فَلَا خَيْرَ فِيكُمْ. Inshallah, I'm going to end there. If there's any questions, you can ask Abu Bakr, because he's the scholar here. But I pray Allah Azza wa Jal allows us at this time to not just be people of words, of just recitation, of just memorization, but actually people of action. And I mean in that, not to harm anyone, not to hurt anyone, but also not to be a bunch of cowards, not to be afraid constantly, because that's what we see is happening with some of our, I will say, our du'at and our leaders and so forth, too afraid. May Allah Azza wa Jalla remove that fear from our hearts and make us into people who fear Allah Azza wa Jalla first and foremost. May Allah Azza wa Jalla unite this ummah on all that is truth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us people of justice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us people of iman. May Allah Azza wa Jalla make us people of faith and trust. Make us people who are a qudwa, who are a guide for other people, and present and make for us guides. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
If we would like to ask a question, stay hand up. If you can just repeat their question